Hi, my name is Velda, and my half-sister didn't just betray me, she poured acid into my food, hoping no one would ever taste my truth. At first, my name was missing from the will, then from the family photos, then from the table. But when she served my recipe on national television and smiled like it had always been hers, I realized I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been erased. And the worst part? Everyone applauded her for it. So how did she end up the one silenced forever? And what really happened when she took a bite of her own revenge? My half-sister poured acid into my food, but she ended up tasting the poison of her own revenge. I remember the exact click of the doorknob as I stepped into that lawyer's office. It was the same kind of polished wood my father loved, mahogany, smooth as stone under your palm, always smelling like a mix of tobacco and old paper. I had walked through doors like this 1,000 times with him, back when I was still his shadow in the kitchen, watching him dice onions with the precision of a surgeon. But that day, that door opened to a room that didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. Everyone was already seated. Malis, of course, was at the center, her hair pinned back neatly, designer blazer too crisp for a Thursday afternoon in Savannah. Our cousins, 2 uncles, and even Aunt Helen, who hadn't visited in 6 years, were there. I stood at the edge, waiting for someone to notice. No one did. The lawyer, Mr. Donahue, barely looked up when he began reading. "To my beloved daughter Malis," he started, and something in my chest gave out like a chair missing a leg. I didn't hear the rest, not really. The room spun slowly as phrases like legacy, restaurant rights, and public brand floated by like steam off a forgotten kettle. My name never came, not once. It was like I didn't exist. In my mind, I saw Dad's hand guiding mine 20 years earlier as he whispered over the hiss of a skillet. "This recipe stays with you, baby. Not because it's written down, but because you feel it." Even ghosts deserve a chair at the table. I didn't get one. When the meeting wrapped, I quietly turned toward the door. I made it just past the coat rack when I heard Malis's voice behind me, hushed but sharp. "She's probably too ashamed to look at anyone." I paused. For half a second, I thought about turning around, saying something, anything, but instead, I breathed in, let it settle in my chest, and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. Outside, Savannah still carried that sticky warmth that made you feel like summer was eavesdropping. I walked past oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, back to my tiny apartment where the paint peeled near the windowsill. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the chipped ceramic plate that used to belong to my father. Not even the plate got a mention in that will. The next evening, Malis hosted a celebration dinner. I received the invitation via a group text, along with the time, the dress code, and a note that said family only. Apparently, I still qualified when it was convenient. I wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no makeup. I arrived 10 minutes early and was told to wait near the kitchen. A waiter eventually led me to my seat, table 6, right next to the restroom. The smell of bleach wafted every time the door opened. I could hear someone sobbing quietly in the next stall, their heels tapping against the tile. Meanwhile, across the room, Malis sat under a chandelier that glittered like applause. Her table had gold-rimmed plates, 3 types of wine glasses, and silver cutlery that practically winked under the soft light. Mine? My fork had a slight bend. The water glass was cloudy with age. I smiled anyway. Because smiling is how you survive in rooms where your presence is an inconvenience. "Thank you all for being here," Malis stood and said with a practiced grin. "Dad believed in legacy, and tonight, I'm honored to continue his dream." People clapped. Someone shouted, "You deserve it, girl!" And I felt my hands grow colder. A family friend leaned over and asked, "Oh, are you on staff tonight?" Her tone was sweet, unassuming, but it stabbed anyway. "No," I replied calmly. "I'm his other daughter." She blinked. "Oh, I thought, never mind." I wasn't mad. I was used to it, used to being the shadow behind the flame. That night, I didn't stay for dessert. I excused myself before the plates were cleared, walked down Whitaker Street, and let the streetlights guide me home. My heels clicked against the pavement like a metronome, steady, restrained. The city was quiet, except for a passing streetcar and the occasional dog bark. When I reached my apartment building, I stood outside a while longer, looking up at the third-floor window where my kitchen light still glowed. The window faced east, facing the street my father and I used to walk after Sunday lunch, just before his arthritis got too bad to move without wincing. The building next door had once housed his little eatery, back before the brand deals and television spots Melis brought in. Now, it sat empty. The signage gone. Only the ghost of the word Grafton's remained. Paint faded, just barely clinging to the brick. I looked up, inhaled, and whispered to no one in particular, "I may not be written into the will, but I'm not invisible." After whispering those words to myself outside the empty building that once held my father's dreams, I didn't go straight home. I walked, not aimlessly, but slow enough for the streetlights to stretch my thoughts. It was like I needed the space between steps to figure out what the silence in me had started to say out loud. That night, when I got in, I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I flicked on the old stove lamp, the one that always gave off a soft yellow glow like a porch light, waiting for someone to come home. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table my dad and I used to knead dough on, back before our family became two sides of a court case. My fingers traced the edge of the wooden surface. That table had scars. Nicks from knives, heat marks from pans set down too fast. And it was at that table that I had first shown Melis the beginning of what became my signature dish. It had been a Sunday afternoon, one of the rare times she'd joined me in the kitchen. She'd walked in with her usual perfume cloud, and that look like she was doing the world a favor by simply existing. She asked questions about spices, genuine ones, I'd thought. I even let her write down a few things in my notebook. I didn't know then that she'd been memorizing everything. What hit me hardest wasn't that she'd taken the recipe. It was that she didn't even flinch when she used it. She didn't hesitate to brand it, sell it, rename it like it had always belonged to her, like I'd just been some helpful bystander in her story of success. 2 days after that dinner party, I was over at Aunt Raina's house, helping her organize boxes in the garage. She's always been one of the few family members who didn't pick sides, mostly because she never saw the point in taking orders from Melis or anyone else. While we sorted through dusty boxes labeled Xmas lights and old cookbooks, her teenage son Darren was watching videos on his phone. "Yo," he called out, "isn't this your sister?" I looked up, wiping my hands on my jeans. He tilted the screen toward me. There she was, Melis, standing center stage at the Southern Food Masters semifinals, smiling like the crowd had been clapping for her since birth. Chef Melis debuts her signature dish, Sunlit Citrus Blaze, the announcer's voice boomed. I stared at the screen, the dish, the color, the garnish, the precise flame-finished citrus curl at the top. It was mine. Every element, every detail I had sweated over for months, right down to the plate. Dad's old ceramic-rimmed bowl. And that name, Sunlit Citrus Blaze? It was a cheap rebrand of what I had always called fire fruit fusion. My throat went dry, not out of shock, no, this had always been a possibility. But something about seeing it broadcast, about watching her bask in credit that didn't belong to her. It felt like being erased in real time. Later that evening, I checked the family group chat. I knew I shouldn't have, but I did. Aunt Helen wrote, "She's glowing, just like her daddy." Uncle Travis followed with, "Melis, you nailed it. He'd be so proud. You're his culinary twin." No one mentioned me, not a single emoji, not a side comment. I could have been a ghost in that thread. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a screenshot. It wasn't about keeping receipts. It was about reminding myself of the silence they chose. That night, I didn't sleep well. My mind kept looping the video in flashes, her voice thanking the judges, her smile, the way she tilted her head just like Dad used to when he explained a flavor profile. I didn't confront her. I could have sent a message, left a voicemail, maybe even showed up at her doorstep, but there was no use in throwing stones at a house built on applause. Instead, I opened one of the few things I had left that connected me to my father, his recipe journal. It was worn, The leather cracked at the spine, corners curled like old leaves. On the third page, in his sharp, slanted handwriting, was a line I hadn't read in years. "The fire in her hands will outlive my name." He wasn't talking about Melis. She'd never spent more than 10 minutes near a stove unless a camera was on. He was talking about me. That line wasn't flattery, it was recognition. I read it again, then again, until the words no longer blurred but burned. At midnight, I turned on the lamp again. I tied my apron behind my back, not the pristine one, the old one with oil stains and my initials stitched in the corner. I opened the fridge, pulled out citrus, ginger, garlic, the core ingredients. I lit the burner, let it hiss and snap like old memories being reheated. I didn't cook like someone preparing for war. I cooked like someone remembering who they were before the world tried to convince them otherwise. My hands moved with memory. I wasn't chasing perfection. I was chasing something older than that. Truth, the kind you can taste. As the sauce simmered, I whispered aloud, not to Melis, not to anyone in particular, but to myself and to the air that had always listened better than most people in my family. She can steal the spotlight, but not the soul. The dish still simmered when I turned off the stove that night, but something inside me had already reached a quiet boil. I cleaned up, not because I wanted to, but because my father always said, "A cook's pride lives in their cleanup, not just their plating." After wiping down the counters, I sat in the soft kitchen light, letting the scent of citrus and spice fade into the walls. 2 days later, as I sat in my small living room folding laundry, a text came through from Aunt Raina. "Thought you'd want to see this. Your sister's made it again." I clicked the link. It opened to a local Savannah food blog titled Southern Star, Melis Carey's Culinary Legacy Forward. My eyes skimmed the first paragraph. Not that I expected anything different. But then, there it was. A photo from our childhood kitchen. The caption read, "Young Melis learning under her father's watchful eye." The problem, I was in that photo. Only you couldn't tell. A deliberate blur of steam covered my face. I knew that blur, because I remembered standing there, holding the knife, while Dad stood behind me, guiding my hand as I sliced through a mango for what would later become the base of fire fruit fusion. Melis hadn't touched a single utensil that day. She'd walked in to grab soda, posed for a second, and walked back out. Now, 2 decades later, the world was being sold a version where she was the star of a moment she hadn't even earned. It wasn't just erasure, it was rewriting. I set my phone down slowly, hands trembling, not with anger, but something colder, something weightier. I wasn't shocked. That kind of betrayal no longer surprised me. What stuck like a pit in my throat was how natural she made it look, as if I'd never been there at all. Later that week, I watched the recording of her award ceremony. Someone in the family had uploaded it to Facebook, complete with hearts and clapping emojis. Melis stood at the podium in a silky navy dress, hair swept into a perfect bun, wearing an expression I knew all too well, like she owned the room before she ever opened her mouth. "I want to thank my mother," she began. "My aunts and uncles, my cousins, especially Denny and Theo, for always believing in me," she continued, listing names like a practiced politician. Not once did my name cross her lips. No Velda, no my sister, not even a vague someone special who helped inspire this. Then she said, clear and sure, "I've always believed talent is inherited, not claimed." The crowd laughed, clapped, some nodded with approving grins. I sat there in my apartment, watching it unfold. My tea went cold. My heart didn't beat faster, but deeper. It settled into a place of stillness where sorrow no longer had a home. What I felt now was purpose. That same day, I got an unexpected email from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Avon. He was now managing one of the regional culinary schools, the same place Melis had done a guest lecture weeks earlier. His email was short, just one sentence. Saw her dish. Something about it felt familiar. That was it. No accusations, no assumptions. But it was enough. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to decide what that sentence meant to me. That night, after washing the dishes and tidying up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the old notebook Dad had left behind. Tucked between two stained pages was a memory I hadn't thought of in years. I was 10. Dad had invited both Maylis and me into the kitchen for what he called Saturday sauce sessions. Maylis had groaned, said, "Why would I spend my weekend smelling like onions?" and stormed off. I'd stayed. I stayed through the burn of garlic in my eyes, through the hours it took to get the texture right, through the way Dad had corrected my grip until my fingers cramped. He didn't pat me on the back. He didn't give me ribbons. He just said, "You stayed. That matters." Now the world clapped for the one who walked out. I whispered aloud, "And now they say it's hers." It was getting late, but sleep wouldn't come. So I opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote a title in all caps, "Things They Erased." Underneath, I began listing. The photo Maylis used in the article, the award speech with no mention of me, the night she took my recipe notes and said she was just curious, the restaurant name Dad chose, how she later trademarked it without asking. By the time I looked up, nearly 3 pages were filled. I flipped to a blank sticky note and scribbled, "Step 1. Keep cooking." Then another, "Step 2. Let the world see what truth tastes like." It wasn't a revenge plan. It was a recipe. The message from Avon sat in my inbox like a flickering pilot light. Small, quiet, but ready to ignite something larger. I didn't answer him right away. I let it sit there, open, visible, like a page in a book I wasn't quite finished reading. The following Saturday, I received an invitation, hand-delivered by a courier in a crisp black suit who didn't say much. Inside was a card from Maylis, elegantly embossed with silver lettering. Pre-competition family dinner, hosted by Maylis Carrington, formal attire, 6:00 p.m., sharp. There was no note, no personal message, just a time, a place, and the silent assumption that I would attend. I stared at the invitation for a few moments, then placed it on the counter next to the sticky notes I'd written days earlier. Step 1. Keep cooking. Step 2. Let the world see what truth tastes like. Step 3, I now realized, would require me to walk back into the very space I had once been erased from, and not flinch. Saturday came quickly. I dressed in a navy wrap dress I'd worn to 2 funerals and 1 job interview. It wasn't flashy, but it fit, and more importantly, it felt like armor. As I pulled into the Carrington estate, yes, she had renamed it, the driveway was already lined with luxury cars. I parked farther down the road, as usual. Some things didn't change, even when everything else had. The house looked just as I remembered, symmetrical, too polished, like it belonged in a catalog, not real life. The front door opened before I even knocked. A young server greeted me, not with a smile, but with practiced neutrality. "Velda Carrington?" he asked, reading off a clipboard. "Right this way." I nodded and followed him through the marble entryway, past the curated decor, into the dining room. The air changed the moment I stepped in. Conversations quieted, glasses were set down. It was the kind of silence people make when they don't know if they should acknowledge your presence or pretend you're part of the wallpaper. Maylis stood at the head of the table, already holding court, her voice mid-story. When she saw me, she gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, look who decided to grace us," she said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Don't worry, Velda. We saved you a seat, right by the window." I walked over and sat down without saying a word. The chair wobbled slightly. My napkin had already been unwrapped and folded beside my plate. Dinner began the way most awkward family meals do. Too many forks, not enough sincerity. I focused on my plate, barely touching the salmon, while small talk buzzed like white noise around me. Halfway through the meal, someone, maybe one of Maylis's new investor friends, stood up and raised a glass. "To Maylis," he said, "the rightful heir to Savannah's culinary crown." People clapped, some louder than others. I raised my glass slowly. Didn't drink, just held it in the air, letting the condensation run down my fingers like melted dignity. That's when it happened. From the kitchen, someone rushed in, whispering frantically to a staff member. Their eyes darted toward Maylis, then toward me. "Has anyone seen the envelope?" a voice called out. "The sponsorship cash envelope? It's missing." Malis stood slowly, scanning the room like a queen surveying her court. "It was right here," she said, "next to the gift bags." A few people started glancing around. A murmur passed from one guest to the next. Then another voice, sharper this time. "We should check everyone's things." Before I could respond, a server approached me, holding my handbag like it was a dirty diaper. "Miss Carrington," he said, "we found this inside." He held up the envelope, creased, slightly open, and full of $100 bills. My throat tightened. "That's not mine," I said firmly. No one spoke. Malis stepped forward, eyebrows raised just enough to sell concern. "I'm sure it's just a mix-up," she said sweetly. "But you understand, we had to check." "Of course," I replied, my voice even. "You always check when something goes missing, just not when credit goes missing, or names, or memories." The room stayed quiet. I placed my napkin on the table and stood up. Not rushed, not flustered, just done. As I turned to leave, someone near the doorway, a woman I didn't recognize, leaned toward the man next to her and whispered, not softly enough, "Isn't she the maid? Why is she even sitting at the table?" A few chuckles followed. Not loud, but enough. Malis didn't correct her. Didn't say a word. I didn't look back. I walked past the framed family photos in the hallway, every single one a curated version of history where I'd either been cropped out or never invited to begin with. And then I passed the portrait of my mother, hung just before the kitchen. I paused, just for a moment. Then I walked outside, the door closing softly behind me. The sky was darkening, streetlights flickering on. I made my way to the sidewalk, heels clicking steadily, each step burning off another layer of shame. When I got home, I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop and created a new folder. Its title, Proof. Inside, I started organizing everything I had: screenshots, video clips, copies of emails, old handwritten notes of Dad's recipes. I scanned every photo Malis had posted and matched them to original timestamps in my own archives. Then I opened a private message tab. Avon. I didn't say hello, didn't ask how he was. I simply typed, "Would you recognize a stolen dish if you saw the original?" The reply came a few minutes later. "Yes, especially if it was yours." The moment I read Avon's message, I felt my spine straighten in the kitchen chair like someone had pulled a string down my back. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't. It was the space he left for me to decide what came next. 5 days before the regional finals, an invitation arrived at my door. This one wasn't sent through a courier. It was slid under the front door, just before dawn, like it didn't want to be seen entering my life. It was from Malis. "Family reconciliation dinner," the header read in her looping cursive. "Let's move forward, together. 6:00 p.m., Thursday." No apology, no acknowledgement, just another spotlight moment with the word family stitched on for convenience. I didn't RSVP. I just showed up. That Thursday, Savannah felt like it was holding its breath. The sky was a chalky gray, the kind that made you keep a jacket in the back seat just in case. I wore something simple: black slacks, a burgundy blouse, and shoes that made no sound when I walked. When I arrived at the house, the door was already open. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They were expecting me, but not as a guest. Inside, everything looked the same: the manicured entryway, the polished banister, the faint smell of citrus cleaner Malis always preferred over anything floral. It felt like stepping into a play where I wasn't handed a script. The dining room was lit to perfection, soft gold tones reflecting off the glasses. Malis stood near the head of the table, a glass of white wine in hand, rehearsing smiles for each new guest. When she saw me, she tilted her head slightly. "Velda, I wasn't sure you'd come." "I'm sure you weren't," I said calmly, stepping in fully. There were no hugs, no hellos, just small nods from relatives who'd once rocked me to sleep, now too invested in keeping things clean and pleasant. I took my seat, same end of the table as last time. Only this time, no one made a fuss. Dinner began like a play with too many acts: forced laughter, obligatory questions, an air of rehearsed forgiveness. Malis dominated the conversation, talking about the competition, the judges, and how our family legacy was now in her hands. Then came the toast. Uncle Howard stood with a glass and cleared his throat. "To Malis, he began, for carrying the Carrington name into every Southern kitchen. We're proud of you. A chorus of glasses clinked. I waited until the sound settled. Then I stood. I didn't say anything at first. I reached into my bag, pulled out an envelope, and placed it gently in the center of the table. Eyes followed it like it might explode. Malis blinked. "What's this?" "A declaration," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "You can read it later. It's notarized. I've waived my claim to the inheritance." There were a few gasps, mostly from cousins who cared more about the drama than the money. "But," I continued, "at the bottom, you'll see a line I added. It reads, 'This does not waive my birthright, nor the name my father gave me.'" A silence heavier than gravy spread across the table. Malis tried to recover quickly. "Well, Velda. Sorry, Velda. That's quite noble of you." The pause between the names was intentional. Everyone at the table felt it. I didn't flinch. Instead, I looked her square in the eyes and replied, "Funny. You always get my name wrong, but you remembered my recipe just fine." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Aunt Raina sipped her water like it suddenly had flavor. I sat down slowly. The conversation didn't recover. Dessert arrived in silence. Pecan pie, Malis's favorite, not Dad's. When it was over, people stood to leave, murmuring polite goodbyes, pretending to check their phones. As I picked up my purse, one of my younger cousins leaned toward me, voice barely above a whisper. "You're stronger than they think," she said. I didn't reply, just nodded. I walked out without looking back. The air outside felt cooler than when I'd arrived, like the house had been breathing in heat and holding it hostage. Driving home, I didn't put on music. I let the silence stretch. I needed it. By the time I stepped into my kitchen, it was close to midnight. But I wasn't tired. I was clear. I tied my apron behind me, turned on the stove, laid out ingredients with care, each motion deliberate, like I was carving my name into the night. This wasn't about nostalgia anymore. This time, I was cooking for more than memory. After I whispered those words to the spice drawer, "Let's finish this the right way," I didn't hesitate. I closed the drawer, washed my hands, and turned off the light in my kitchen. The next few days would test every ounce of control I had left, and I couldn't afford to let rage drive the wheel. Not anymore. This wasn't about being angry. This was about being undeniable. The morning of the regional competition arrived like Savannah herself was holding her breath. The streets were damp from the night's rain, and the sky hung low with a kind of quiet pressure. I left my apartment before sunrise, my apron folded precisely in my tote, knives wrapped in the same cloth Dad used when he taught me how to sharpen them. When I arrived at the Culinary Academy, Avon was already outside the prep entrance, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other. He didn't say much. He just handed me a badge and said, "You got this." Then he walked away before I could respond. That small moment, his calm, his belief, settled into my bones. I headed to my station, set up my ingredients, and ran through my checklist like it was gospel. Everything felt right. Everything felt earned. That is, until I stepped away to use the restroom and returned 10 minutes later to find things off. My spice rack had been rearranged. My sauce, one I'd left simmering, was bubbling too aggressively. The smell sharper, acrid. I leaned in, stirred, and something in my gut told me this wasn't heat. It was sabotage. I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone over. I simply took the pot off the stove, set it aside, and pulled out a backup batch I had prepped the night before. Something told me I'd need it. I wasn't wrong. Later that afternoon, one of the assistant chefs flagged down a supervisor near my station. He held up a small plastic container, the label peeled off, but still partially legible. It had been stuffed behind my prep box. "Smells industrial," he said, handing it to Avon. Avon sniffed it once, grimaced, and said one word: bleach. That was all it took. The air in the kitchen turned icy. Someone called over the culinary board's internal inspector. There was a quiet investigation, no alarms, no accusations, just the kind of tight-lipped professionalism that tells you people are about to pretend nothing happened. But I knew better. I knew who had done it. That evening, I received another invitation, this time to Melis's so-called family support reception following the day's events. The finals were only 2 days away, and she had already begun building the narrative. The story was hers. Again, I considered skipping it, but something told me I needed to be there, to see what came next. I arrived just after 7. The house was already full, music humming low, the smell of catered hors d'oeuvres thick in the air. Before I could set down my purse, someone handed me a tray. "Can you bring this to the patio?" the young woman asked without looking me in the eye. I stared at the tray, then at her. "You think I work here?" She blinked. "Aren't you—" She didn't finish the sentence. I took the tray anyway, walked it through the crowd, and placed it on the patio table with a calm I didn't know I still had left. From across the room, I caught Melis watching me, her expression unreadable. She didn't approach, she didn't apologize, she just watched like a hawk sizing up another predator. As I made my way back inside, I heard a man's voice murmur to his wife. "Didn't she work here before?" The wife laughed. "Might as well." That was enough for me. I left without saying a word. The next morning, I arrived at the academy early again. This time, I didn't go to my station. I found Avon in his office, staring at a screen. He motioned for me to come closer, then hit play. The footage was crystal clear. Melis, wearing a pristine white coat, her hair pulled back like she belonged in a commercial, walked over to my workstation. She looked around, then pulled a small container from her pocket, unscrewed it, poured something into my sauce. It wasn't just caught on tape. It was undeniable. I watched the footage twice, then turned to Avon. "Send me a copy," I said quietly. "It's time." He nodded. That night, I didn't sleep. I uploaded the footage to a private drive. Then I forwarded it, anonymously, to the regional board with a subject line that simply read, "For your integrity review." I didn't include a message. The video said everything. Afterward, I returned to my kitchen, reopened the spice drawer, and pulled out the one Dad labeled Rescue Mix, a blend of heat and depth he only used when a dish needed saving. I laid it on the counter, took out my notes, and began again. This wasn't about beating Melis anymore. This was about restoring what she had tried to destroy. My identity, my name, my place at the table. I whispered again, this time not to the drawer, but to the air itself. "Let's finish this the right way." I arrived early for the finals that night, not out of nerves, but necessity. I needed to feel the room before it filled, needed to breathe in its emptiness before it became something else. A stage, a crucible, a trap. The Savannah Culinary Academy's grand demonstration hall had always towered above me when I was younger. Vaulted ceilings that echoed every footstep. Marble floors so smooth they felt like mirrors underfoot. There was no room for error here, no shadows to hide in. Just light, just scrutiny. Tonight, every inch of this space would be watching. My station was set with surgical precision, ingredients lined up like soldiers, sauces portioned, spices measured, every blade honed, every pan polished to a mirror's edge. I didn't bring notes, I didn't need them. The recipe for fire fruit fusion pulsed through me like a second heartbeat. My father's voice echoed in each step, steady as breath. I didn't come to prove anything, I came to tell the truth. By 6, the guests began to arrive. Judges took their seats with measured expressions and the stiff, slow grace of people trained never to react. They carried clipboards, wore polite nods, the kind of faces that made you doubt your own senses. The cameras were already perched, tripods steady, red lights glowing. I spotted Avon near the front, his arms crossed, body still but alert. He wasn't smiling, but when he met my gaze, he gave a slight nod. It wasn't encouragement, it was acknowledgement. "You're here. I see you." That was enough. By 7:30, the competition officially began. And, like clockwork, Melis arrived late. Of course she did. Always the last to enter, always the first to be noticed. She claimed it was about drama, flair, but we both knew what it really was. Dominance. Control. She wore red. a bold, blood-colored coat dress that stood in sharp contrast to the sea of pressed white chef coats. Her heels echoed like punctuation marks. Her smile was glossy and easy. Her eyes were anything but. She gave me one glance, measured, cool, and moved on. We were each given 45 minutes. Just one dish, just one shot. We moved with purpose. Our stations clicked into rhythm, flames rising, metal clattering, oils simmering low. I didn't look her way once. I didn't need to. I had the meat already marinated. The sauce simmered, layered with heat and sweetness, cooled to just the right pitch. I caramelized the fruit until it shimmered under the kitchen lights. Every plate I touched was treated like an altar. Tonight wasn't about performance. It was about proof. Then came the sound. A sharp crash, like the world splitting open. I turned, along with everyone else. Maylis stood frozen. Her plate, her final dish, lay shattered at her feet, porcelain and charred meat scattered across the floor like ruins. For a moment, she just stared at it. And then, without missing a beat, she pivoted, straight toward the prep table behind me. I knew before I even saw her hands reach. My blood chilled. She reached for a sealed container, one of dozens, neatly labeled and stacked, identical in appearance. Except this one wasn't like the others. I had marked it. Compromised. Handwritten. Faintly smudged, but still legible if you looked. She didn't look. She didn't care. This was the batch I'd set aside after discovering someone had tampered with it, altered the proportions of a spice blend I hadn't used since the training rounds. I hadn't discarded it. I kept it, quietly, as documentation. In case she tried something else, now it was in her hands. She opened the lid, stirred it once, and began plating with clinical precision. I said nothing. Neither did Avon. Silence was sharper than confrontation. The judges began tasting. I watched. Maylis stepped up to the podium, posture flawless, voice echoing through the room. I present Sunlit Citrus Blaze, built on tradition, elevated with passion. The first judge took a bite. He blinked, then flinched. Subtle, but real. The second paused, fork halfway to his lips, then reached for his water instead. The third leaned back, brow furrowed, lips pursed. Something was wrong. Everyone felt it. Still smiling, Maylis dipped her own spoon in, probably to maintain her charade, to reinforce her ownership of the dish, to close the loop with performance. She didn't even swallow. The moment the sauce touched her tongue, her body betrayed her. The smile collapsed, her eyes widened, her body lurched. She recoiled, coughing, gasping, red spreading across her face, hands trembling. The spoon clattered to the floor. A judge stood and called for help. The room burst into motion. The MC dropped his mic. Guests stood, some filming, some shouting. Phones rose like waves crashing in the fluorescent sea. And I stood still. Hands resting gently on my counter, like stone in the center of a storm. Paramedics arrived within minutes. She was escorted out, blotched and breathless, mouth swollen, unable to speak clearly. Someone whispered, allergic reaction. Someone else said, cross-contamination. I said nothing. Avon said nothing. The competition was paused, then quietly, canceled. No winner declared, no trophies handed out. Just silence. I stayed behind as the room emptied. At some point, I ended up sitting near the prep sinks, the stainless steel cool beneath my palms. I stared at my own reflection in a pot that hadn't yet been scrubbed. I wasn't sure how long I'd been there when Avon approached. He held up his phone. "They know it wasn't you," he said. "The footage is already circulating." I nodded once. "What about her?" I asked. It wasn't vengeance, just curiosity. He sighed, eyes distant. "Chemical burns," he said. "Severe. The doctors are doing what they can, but the prognosis isn't good. The taste buds don't always recover." I said nothing. Didn't cheer. Didn't rage. I just let the weight settle. Maylis, the woman who had built her entire empire on her palate, had lost the one thing that could not be faked. The irony didn't feel sweet. It felt complete. Later that night, lying in bed with the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, I glanced at my phone. A headline pulsed across the screen. Top culinary star suffers taste loss in mysterious incident during competition. I didn't click it. I didn't need to. The truth was already simmering. And this time, I wasn't the one left burned. I woke up the next morning to a kitchen still soaked in silence. The sun hadn't fully risen, but I was already dressed, coffee brewed, and the floor beneath my bare feet colder than usual. Outside, birds chirped like the world hadn't changed, but something had. There were no reporters at my door. No social media mobs chanting my name or dragging hers through the dirt. And yet, I knew. The storm had already started brewing somewhere far louder than the space I stood in. By 9, I was rinsing dishes when a soft ping echoed from my phone. An email, subject line, "Your father's truth." There was no sender's name, just a secure link and a one-line message. "He meant for you to have this." My breath caught as I clicked. It opened to a voice recording, dated 2 months before his stroke. I hesitated before pressing play. My hands trembled, and I gripped the edge of the counter like it might brace me for what came next. Then, his voice. "Velda," he began, raspy but firm. "If you're hearing this, then the truth still matters. That dish, it was always yours. You learned it with your hands, your patience, your heart. Malis didn't want it. She didn't care about the history, the soul of it, but you stayed. You stayed when no one else did." A pause. "I'm proud of you. I just hope one day the world sees it too." I didn't realize I'd started crying until the tears hit my sleeves. It wasn't just a recipe he'd given me, it was acknowledgement, a validation I had waited for, not with hope, but with the kind of quiet desperation only those who've been repeatedly erased can understand. I played the message again and again, until it was no longer pain that made me cry, but release. Around noon, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the folder labeled Proof. It wasn't vengeance I felt anymore, it was duty. I uploaded the voice clip and paired it with the security footage. Malis in full color, pouring bleach into my pot like it was nothing but another secret ingredient. Then I logged into a private forum where industry professionals and culinary insiders quietly exchanged ideas, critiques, and sometimes confessions. I posted everything. No caption, no commentary, just the raw truth. By nightfall, it had spread farther than I expected. Food bloggers picked it up first, then regional newspapers, then one of the more prominent chef networks did a full exposé titled The Firefruit Scandal, How Theft and Sabotage Burned a Star. I didn't leave the house that night. I didn't need to. I watched it all unfold from my phone while sitting in the same chair my dad used to sip his Sunday coffee in. By morning, Malis's name was trending, and not in the way she liked. The Academy released a short statement. "We are aware of the allegations involving former student Malis Carrington. An internal review has been initiated. Until further notice, all professional affiliations are suspended." Then came the sponsors, one after another, dropping her like a bad investment. The biggest cookware brand she represented replaced her with a chef from Atlanta within 24 hours. Avon sent me a text just after lunch. "They're calling it the Firefruit Scandal. You were brave." I didn't reply, not because I wasn't grateful, but because I didn't feel brave. I just felt resolved. 3 days later, a reporter called, then another. They wanted interviews, sound bites, my face next to headlines that read like redemption arcs written by someone else. I declined them all. I didn't need the world to hear me speak. They had already heard my father's voice. Instead, I focused on something far more important. I reopened my father's kitchen, not in name, in spirit. The building had been sitting empty for months. The sign above the doorway, once reading Carrington Daughters, had been taken down after his passing. I chose something different. Em Ut, Vietnamese for youngest daughter. A nod to the name he used when we were alone in the kitchen, cooking late into the night while Malis scrolled through magazines. It took weeks of deep cleaning, permits, late nights painting walls, and scrubbing the ghosts off tile. But when it opened, we didn't have a ribbon-cutting ceremony. We didn't need it. On the first night, people came quietly, a few locals. A couple of culinary students who recognized me from the forums. A woman who used to work with my father brought a bouquet of fresh herbs. I cooked behind the counter like I always had, apron tied, hair pulled back, silence filled with scent. The dish, fire fruit fusion, unedited, unrebranded. The same version I had memorized through muscle memory, layered with the kind of heat that told a story with every bite. The first review landed on a small blog 2 days later. It read, "Every bite tastes like someone who chose truth over applause." That night, I stood in the kitchen long after the last customer left. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just listened to the quiet hum of the fridges, the faint clink of a spoon left soaking in a sink, the echo of my father's words in the corners of the room. I never wanted revenge, but life served it anyway. 6 months had passed since that night at the academy, the night when the truth, long buried beneath image and expectation, finally stood up, pulled out a chair, and sat beside me like an old friend who'd waited too long to be heard. It hadn't come with applause. It came quietly. And that was how I wanted it to stay. Now, it was early spring in Savannah, that kind of season where everything begins to bloom again, but gently, without announcement. The magnolias were just starting to open, bold white blossoms pushing out through stubborn winter branches like forgiveness itself. Not the kind of forgiveness you give to others because they've earned it, but the kind you offer yourself because you're finally ready to let go of what never served you. The air carried a subtle warmth, like the city had taken a long breath and was exhaling softly, whispering, "You've survived." The reopening of my father's kitchen wasn't grand. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no PR team orchestrating Instagram teasers or last-minute press blasts, no sponsored posts or countdowns. I didn't hire a photographer or pitch the story to the local food blogs. I didn't need spectacle, just a new beginning. All I did was hang a hand-painted wooden sign above the door, letters carved one afternoon with sandpaper and patience. It was enough. That morning, just before 8 a.m., I unlocked the door myself. The key turned without resistance. Something about that felt symbolic. Inside, the scent of lemon oil and charred wood still lingered in the air. The kind of seasoning you don't wash away, not because you can't, but because you shouldn't. The stove I'd restored and seasoned myself stood proud, humming quietly like it remembered everything. Soft pendant lights glowed overhead. The front counter had been buffed to a shine. 3 tables sat waiting, modest, sturdy, familiar. Like old friends who knew your stories and didn't need them retold. I didn't know if anyone would come, but they did. The first to arrive was a neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Germain, who had always left her porch light on late, even when no one came home. Then a retired couple who used to eat here when my father ran the place. They told me he once brought them a bowl of soup on the house when they were grieving a loss they hadn't even spoken out loud. Word traveled, not like fire, like warmth. By noon, the tables were full. No frenzy, no line out the door, just a steady stream of people who came not to be impressed, but to be fed. By 6 p.m., I was sold out. I hadn't served anything designed to trend. No fancy plating, no nitrogen clouds or edible gold leaf. Just food that tasted like truth. The original fire fruit fusion. Chicken braised low and slow in garlic and lemongrass until it pulled apart with a glance. Sweet corn grits, just like Dad used to make them, rich with coconut cream and a hint of lime. I plated each dish with both hands, every motion anchored in memory, in freedom, in the knowledge that I had nothing left to prove. Close to closing, as I was wiping down the prep station, he came in, a boy, maybe 10, maybe younger, round glasses perched too big for his face. His hands clung to his mother's as they finished their meal. She nudged him gently toward me. He approached, hesitating for only a second before stepping up to the counter. "Miss Velda?" he asked. His voice was soft, but certain. I leaned down, damp cloth still in hand. "Yes, sweetheart?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Do you think someone like me could ever cook like this?" And there it was. The question I'd once asked in my own way. The kind that doesn't just want advice, it wants belief. So I knelt beside him, wiped my hands on my apron, and smiled. "If you cook with heart," I said, "they'll always taste it, every single time." His face lit up, Not for praise, but for possibility. That moment. That meant more to me than any trophy Malus ever took credit for. That night, after the last dish was dried and the lights turned low, I locked up and took the long way home. I walked, no headphones, no podcast, just me, the cool breeze, and the city exhaling around me. I passed the building that had once housed Malus's restaurant. It stood hollow now, the lights off. The sign cracked and barely hanging, one half missing entirely, the other clinging to the siding like a forgotten promise. A poster was still taped to the front window, its corners curling like dying petals. Taste the legacy. Someone had scratched her name out, hard, deep. I didn't smile, I didn't scoff, I didn't feel victorious, I just kept walking. That building wasn't a monument to failure. It was a monument to truth, the kind that endures long after press releases and publicists lose their grip. When I got home, I pulled on my oldest pair of sweats and poured myself a cup of green tea. The walls were quiet, but not empty. The air was full of something softer. I turned on the Bluetooth speaker my dad had given me just before he passed, still wrapped in duct tape, still a little busted. I scrolled through my private playlist, all the way to the bottom. Track 99. Dad, final message. I pressed play. His voice filled the room like wind slipping through a screen door. If you're still cooking, then I know you're still fighting. A pause. Not against people, but for yourself, for what matters. I let the message play through, untouched. Then I turned off the lights and sat with the stillness. It no longer felt like waiting. It felt like belonging. In the weeks that followed, offers came in. Book deals, TV pilots, guest chef appearances. I said no, not from bitterness, but because I didn't want a brand. I wanted a home. Oot was enough. A place where I knew every corner, every groove in the countertop, every hum of the oven when it's ready, not because a timer tells me, but because I know. A place where people didn't come for spectacle, they came for something warm, something real. The final piece of closure arrived with no fanfare, a tan envelope in my mailbox, no return address. Inside, a folded photograph, the original, me and Dad in the kitchen. The same image Malus had once edited to blur me out, steam added where my face had been. But not this time. This one was clear. There I was, 12 years old, too small for the chef's coat, holding a cleaver nearly as long as my arm. Dad behind me, one hand on my shoulder, smiling. No note, just the picture. I framed it, hung it above the register. Not to prove anything, not to gloat, but to remember, to tell the truth, to mark the beginning of a legacy that belonged to both of us, not built on ego or erasure, but fire, family, and flavor. And maybe one day, someone will make my recipe, not for likes, not for followers, but for the people at their table. And that will be enough. Because it always was. Sometimes, the justice we seek doesn't come through confrontation, but through quiet, unwavering truth. Velda didn't scream, didn't fight dirty. She simply let her integrity do the speaking. What would you have done if you were her? Would you have walked away? Or stayed and reclaimed your name? If this story moved you, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one, because sometimes the quietest voices echo the loudest.